Welcome to C2GTalk, a series of one-on-one interviews with influential practitioners and thought leaders to explore the governance challenges raised by emerging approaches to alter the climate. I'm Mark Turner, Senior Communications Consultant with Carnegie Climate Governance Initiative, and I'm speaking today with Dr. Roberto Schaeffer, one of the world's leading experts on energy and climate change, who currently teaches and conducts research at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Amongst his many achievements, he leads one of the 4 teams globally selected to have an illustrative mitigation pathway, IMP, and we'll discuss what that is in a minute, represented in the most recent Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report, showing a possible future compatible with well below 2 degrees C warming. He also works on improving the integrated assessment models central to the IPCC's work, which explore the complex interactions between economics, policy, and the physical impacts of climate change. Welcome, Roberto Schaeffer, to C2GTalk.
Thank you, Mark. My pleasure.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. And perhaps we'll begin with a little bit of unraveling what some of these terms mean, understanding how climate models work, what they say, what they don't say, with what certainty is notoriously difficult, even for experts and decision makers, let alone the general public. So let's start there. Perhaps we can explore, what does an integrated assessment model do? And how accurate are the models we currently have at both a large and smaller scale?
Well, Mark, let's say we're talking about here mathematical tools, right, that are designed to help us understand human development, societal changes, and the way, let's say, each one affect the other, and also the natural ecosystem. So they are mathematical tools. As such, they are somehow, let's say, simplifications of reality, because if they are not simplifications, they would be reality themselves. So the idea here is try to capture all the complexity of the Earth system, of society, future socioeconomic development. So basically, these are very complex tools. We're talking about, let's say, sometimes you can run a model that's going to take days for you to find a final result. But as of today, these are the best tools we have to deal with, as I said, socioeconomic development, population growth, emissions, costs for future society, etc., etc. So this is what we have, and somehow is being used very well. And the IPCC relies, as of today, very heavily on the results from those integrated assessment models.
And how confident can we be in how closely these models relate to reality?
Let's say they are good if you think in the short term. Because when you talk about a model like this, we're talking about, let's say, thousands of technologies being represented in those models. So we try to project how the cost of a solar PV will evolve from today up to 2100. We're trying to represent in that model the future cost of concentrated solar power, the future cost of electric batteries for cars. So let's say we can say that they are pretty good, let's say, to explore the future, but only in the future we're going to be able to tell, let's say, whether or not, let's say, they were good enough to forecast what's really going to happen in the future. But again, these are the best tools we have so far. And when we look back, because basically IAMs, the integrated assessment models, have been used for 20 years or more. So somehow now we already have, let's say, scenarios that were built 20 years ago, when today was the future, and they were pretty good at somehow, let's say, anticipating what in reality we have achieved by 2022.
Great. Well, using those models, I guess, can you tell me a little bit about pathways? And there's various versions: illustrative mitigation pathway, representative concentration pathway, shared socioeconomic pathways. Can you help untangle a little bit of this?
Okay, let's talk about, let's say, representative concentration pathways, or what we call RCPs. Let's say it's a kind of metric or indicator, let's say, to tell, let's say, the public or even scientists what's the imbalance between solar radiation that reaches the Earth system and how much of that radiation is re-emitted by the Earth system. basically what we have today, let's say we receive more radiation that we have been able to re-emit simply because we have created, let's say, a layer of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere that's blocking part of this re-emission that would be necessary for us to keep this balance. And this imbalance is exactly what's causing global warming. So for example, when you talk about the RCPs today, we're talking about a RCP that roughly is about 1.5 watts per square meter. What does it mean? It means that it's a kind of, let's say, a metric that help us understand that this is as if each square meter of the Earth's surface today has a light bulb with a power of 1.5 watts, which is roughly 25% of the power of the light bulbs we have in our fridges, in our kitchens. And basically we're generating heat at that pace. So as of today, we have this imbalance. And when you're talking about, for example, a 1.5 degree world or a 2-degree world, we're roughly speaking about a world that's going to have a RCP of 1.9 watts per square meter, or in the case of a 2-degree world, of a RCP 2.6 watts per square meter. So this is a good indicator to show, let's say, how bad or how well we're doing to deal with this imbalance. And that's why it's so critical, and probably going to be talking about this later, to reach the net zero emissions over time. Because only when you have net zero, that basically we stop, not the imbalance, but basically you freeze that imbalance at the level that you are when you reach net zero. And that's why later on, we're going to need to have net negative emissions to try to extract from the atmosphere CO2 to try to bring this RCP down again.
And what about the other pathways I mentioned, like shared socioeconomic pathways and yeah.
Okay, so shared socioeconomic pathways, or SSPs. Basically, this is, let's say, a kind of representation of the future given in a kind of socioeconomic storyline. So basically, as of today, the scientists have agreed in defining 5 different SSPs. And these 5 different SSPs are different future storylines. Let's say a storyline with more equality, a storyline with more dependence on fossil fuels, a storyline with more rivalry between countries. So these are possible futures, and each possible future from a socio-economic point of view will have an implication in terms of emissions, will have an implication in terms of adaptation, will have an implication in terms of the level of mitigation we're going to need to be able to keep temperature at any level we want.
And finally,
and finally, the illustrative mitigation pathways. What are these? In this most recent IPCC report, which was released April this year, basically we have reviewed or collected roughly 2,000 global mitigation scenarios that were available in the literature. But because it is too difficult to discuss 2,000 different things, we decided to choose or to elect 5 illustrative mitigation pathways, because we thought these 5 stories would be good stories to tell to the public on what would be necessary to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees or below 2 degrees. So these are 5 different pathways. One pathway relying more on renewable energy, one pathway relying more on low energy demand, one pathway relying more on shifting pathways in terms of socio-economic development, another pathway relying heavily on negative emissions, and finally a 5th one relying on not doing much in the short term, and then later on having to do a lot to compensate for that. So we thought that 5, let's say, storylines based on this more than 2,000 mitigation scenarios we collected from literature would be very interesting to represent that we still have time to limit temperature to 1.5 or 2 degrees, but there are different consequences associated with that.
So it's not predictions, it's laying out potential paths and then we choose between them. I mean, how do these pathways help policymakers choose the right way forward? Perhaps you can...
Yeah, as you said well, Mark, we're not making predictions here, but basically exploring possible futures. And each one of these 5 different IMPs, illustrative mitigation pathways, show what would be needed if you want to rely more on solar energy, for example. In that case, chances are that you're going to need to rely less on CDR, carbon dioxide removal. Or if you have a future that is able to cope with lower demand for energy, in that case, this future will look different. Society will have different costs for that, etc., etc. So basically, we want to show, let's say, different, let's say, highways for the future, each one with its specificities, costs, impacts, etc., etc.
So I realize this is now, given all these possible scenarios or pathways, going to be a reductive question, but what can we say about the likelihood of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees C or even to 2 degrees C, as the famous phrase at the climate summit, when is 1.5 still alive? And so basically, are there pathways which would allow the world to stay below that level of warming with limited or no overshoot, i.e. the idea that temperatures rise up and go down again?
Yeah, Mark, let's say, when we have these discussions over the past 2 or 3 years during the construction of this IPCC report, we had these discussions, let's say, because we had these, let's say, more than 2,000 mitigation scenarios that we have been able to categorize by temperature. So some of those scenarios would lead to a world in 2100 below 1.5 degrees. Some would lead us to 1.5 degrees with overshoot. Some to a 2-degree world, some to 2.5, some to 3 degrees, or 4 or 5. So what we decided to do, okay, let's pick, let's say, a very small number of pathways. We decided to pick 5, and let's focus on, let's say, mostly pathways that limit temperature to 1.5 with low or no overshoot. So 3 out of these 5 IMPs are in this category, 1.5 with no or limited overshoot. 1 has a high overshoot, but goes down to 1.5 degrees later on during the century, and 1 only is able to keep temperature below 2 degrees. Why we decided to have, let's say, 3 scenarios, 1.5, 1 and 1.5 with overshoot, and 1 2 degrees? Exactly because, as you said, chances are that if you do not act very soon, in the next IPCC report, in 5 or 6 years' time, 1.5 degree world probably is going to be over already. So this is our last chance to still explore those scenarios and show what will be needed to be able to reach that goal. If you do not take actions very shortly, as you said, 1.5 without overshoot is not a chance, no chance anymore. 1.5 with overshoot also very low chance, and eventually only the 2-degree world will still be possible if you do not act very soon.
Thinking back over your years of work doing these, how have you seen those probabilities of achieving these pathways evolve? I don't know if you had all the pathways in the same way before to compare directly, but you've just said with no overshoot, at what point did there used to be a greater possibility of achieving that?
Yeah, let's say, more and more we're trying to give a kind of probabilistic approach to those pathways. But as of today, we're not exactly capable of saying which pathway is more likely. Right. Simply because, let's say, mathematically speaking, you can say that, but we cannot say what exactly different countries or governments are going to be able to do. Yeah. So we say, if you go that way, as indicated by one specific IMP, you have X% chances of limiting temperature to 1.5. If you go that way, according to this pathway, you have X% chances of limiting temperature to 2 degrees. But this is a kind of menu of options we're offering to different governments, and provided that they are not going to follow exactly what is indicated in IMP, it's very difficult to say what are the chances of limiting warming to a specific temperature.
So I wanted to dig into this sort of concept of overshoot a little bit more and what that means. So obviously, the more the temperature rises above 1.5 degrees C and the longer it does so for, the greater the risks. Given what you just said, to what degree do you see countries putting in place mechanisms to manage the risks of overshoot, whether a little, a lot, or not possible to come back. Do you see that countries are beginning to tackle with the reality that there will be an overshoot?
Yeah, Mark, it's very sad to say, but no. Let's say what we have today, let's say all or almost all countries already have their pledges, and basically their pledges are written in their NDCs, their national determined contributions. And those NDCs mostly make reference to the year 2025 or 2030. So those countries have pledges where they want to be in 2030. And some of them now also have pledges up to 2050. Okay, country A may say, I want to be net zero CO2 by 2050. Country B may say, I want to be net zero CO2 by 2060, or net zero greenhouse gas emissions by year X. So we have those pledges, but many studies show, and the IPCC report also show, that the pledges that we have in place today are not enough for a 1.5 degree world. It's not even enough for a 2-degree world. It's probably enough for a 3-degree warmer world. But even the situation is even worse than that, because what we see, even having pledges that are not good enough, countries are not even being able to do what they are promising in their pledges. So we have not only an emissions gap associated with the pledges, but we also have an implementation gap, because even the pledges or the NDCs are not being completely fulfilled as of today. So the situation is really, let's say, it's very bad.
But do you see countries and policymakers recognizing that reality, that they are going to have to prepare for a situation of, as you say, over 1.5, probably over 2, depending upon what happens next? Are you seeing the sort of psychological shift to, well, this is what an overshoot means, and this is how we need to start preparing for it?
Unfortunately, I don't think so, Mark. What happens here? Let's say we're talking about the governments that typically have mandates that last for 4 years, 5 years, eventually you have a re-election for 8 years or 10 years. And those pledges, we're talking about something for 2030, 2040, 2050. So I would say it's very easy for you to pledge something for 2050 if you know that you're not going to be here, or you're not going to be in charge of your country by the time that pledge is already due. So that's why, let's say, some pledges are pretty ambitious, but I doubt, let's say, whether or not we're going to be able to get there. And what's important here, because some of these pledges, or most of them, are specific about year 2030, are specific about 2050. But really what we need here is not what to do in 2030 or 2050, but how to get there. So we're really talking about a pathway, because 2030 is important, by 2031 is important, 2029 is important. So, and most countries only, let's say, focus on specific years, but they don't have strong plans behind that to justify how to get there and where they are going to go after that.
Or to reduce the risks of a warmer world.
Exactly.
You've mentioned earlier carbon dioxide removal as one of the components of various pathways. So all the pathways that still holding on to 1.5 include large-scale carbon dioxide removal to achieve net zero and eventually net negative emissions. In other words, removing CO2 already in the atmosphere. Can you say a little bit about the rising awareness of the importance or possibility or likelihood of large-scale CDR in your opinion? How has this debate changed over the past year or so?
Well, when we talk about CDR, carbon dioxide removal, we have to make clear that we have different kinds of CDR. So we have those that we call let's say, nature-based solutions. So reforestation, afforestation, improving pasture quality, improving the soil quality to retain more carbon. All these are CDR kind of things, right? The other thing is what we call a technological CDR. For example, direct air capture, which is to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, or let's say what we call enhanced weathering, which is to capture also CO2 from the atmosphere in specific chemical materials, etc. So these are very technological ones. So what we can say is that any kind of mitigation pathway for a 1.5 degree world, 2 degree, 2.5, 3, even 4, some level of CDR will always be there. The issue is, let's say, how much CDR we want and whether or not we want to go to more advanced technological-based CDR, which are extremely risky. Let's say, when you talk about DAC, direct air capture, we don't have this technology yet, or what we have, we only have at a very small scale, is extremely expensive. And if in our models, let's say, for some reason, our models choose too much CDR, for sure, this will leave some space open for not doing much in the short term, with the expectation that later on, we're going to find a technological fix to solve the problem. So that's why, let's say, these different mitigation pathways, these different IMPs, they rely differently on CDR. Out of these 5 IMPs that we have briefly discussed so far, one is called negative emissions. This one really relies very heavily on CDR. In fact, this is a scenario that leads us to a 1.5 degree world with high overshoot, because it's a scenario where we continue to rely heavily in the short term on fossil fuels, with the expectation that after the middle of the century, CDR will be mature enough to extract CO2 from the atmosphere, and basically you can compensate what we have done wrong in the beginning later on. Very risky. So these are the trade-offs that we have here.
I wonder if I could dig into this, the concept of the risk, which I think the one you're referring to is often known as moral hazard, or sometimes mitigation deterrence. So there's various, and actually it's breaking out in some ways into the mainstream debate now, as increasing number of companies and countries are beginning to take, the idea of CDR increasingly seriously. Perhaps in the States, there's a lot of attention now on this sector. So within the models, or within the various scenarios and pathways, do you include the effect of this moral hazard? Can you build that in, that if you do more investment in CDR, that'll have a knock-on effect on mitigation? How do you model that within the integrated assessment models?
Let's say what we have been able to do is, is to show the implications of using more or less of one technology on the other technologies.
Right.
So these models are good exactly for that. So some of these IMPs, for example, almost by construction, force more CDR over time. And then we can see what are the implications of doing that in the short term for the fossil fuel sector, for the nuclear sector, etc., etc. But we are not able exactly, to assess what's the moral hazard behind that. We're just playing with numbers here and show this is more risky, but perhaps it's cheaper if in the long term, we are able to dominate that technology. So we're playing with numbers here, but again, we're expecting in those scenarios that rely more on CDR, that in the future, technology will be readily available at a cost that is acceptable to society. And that's why, the best approach here would be one of, a kind of precautionary principle. Would be much, much better not to run the risk of realizing later on that that technology that you're expecting to be mature by 2050 is not mature, and then there's nothing to do anymore. So that's why most, ambitious scenarios try to do as much as possible in the short term, using technology that we know that work, that are not expensive. And in that case, nature-based solutions is a key issue here. There's no reason from any perspective to increase deforestation, no reason not to promote afforestation, reforestation, be more efficient in the use of energy, try to rely more on renewable energy. So these are all good things. And
unless the forest is put on somebody's food crop land, that might create, they might not think it was so good.
Yeah, but again, many studies have shown that we have enough space in the world for agriculture, for food, and also for preserving or increasing our forests.
There was another aspect to this, and I think I'm not sure how much it's becoming mainstream, but there was this suggestion, there were some ideas, for example, I think that came from India recently, that developed countries should go faster towards net negative emissions in order to allow developing countries a little bit longer to emit, to obviously reduce poverty. I mean, there's an element of climate justice in this argument, even some element, as some have suggested, of decolonizing the atmosphere from past CO2. Do you see this idea emerging, and do you examine how that sort of balance between some nations now may have a historic responsibility to go negative faster? Are you putting that in the models in some way?
Yes, let's say most of the scenarios represented in the IPCC database, they rely on what we call a least cost solution, meaning that if it's cheaper to reduce emissions, let's say in India, and it's more expensive to reduce emission in the US, the model will choose to do something in India and less in the US. So this is the way those models normally work, least cost solutions, meaning that in order to address this issue of justice, you have to think about financing mechanisms, technology transfer mechanisms, capacity building to allow those countries, let's say, that eventually are not prepared or do not have the funds to do that, to do something that's going to be good for them, but also for the world. But alternatively, we're also running different scenarios using what we call different burden sharing schemes. So we play with that as well. Okay, so we can have a world where each person in the world have the same right to emit, or each country in the world or each person in the world have the same right to cumulative emissions over time. Or so different schemes are possible. We play with that, so different scenarios available in the literature show what are the implications for different countries depending upon which burden sharing scheme you are using. The major conclusion on that is that all these are the burden sharing schemes lead to higher global costs. Okay. Meaning that, let's say, even for India, would be good to go to a least cost approach, provided that the international, let's say, we would have international money flowing to those countries in order to make viable what from a perspective of a country does not make sense or is not possible.
But that's a big provided that.
Yes. But let's say, we have scenarios showing exactly that. Let's say, what are the implications for different countries or different burden schemes, and also the cost for that country, and also the cost for the global economy. But again, this is a concern, let's say, we have in those scenarios to show that, for example, some countries today rely heavily on fossil fuels because they export a lot of fossil fuels. And in a very, let's say, ambitious scenarios, fossil fuels will play a minor role in the future. So this will have implications for those countries. So you have to think about a kind of, let's say, financing mechanism to be able to allow those countries to go through a kind of just transition, because they are doing something that is good for them, but eventually is much better for the world. So those models are trying to capture that as well.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to another set of potential ideas that people are raising, given the huge challenges on cutting, ending emissions and CO2 removal. There are scientists and policy experts beginning to explore this idea of solar radiation modification, the idea that you reflect a portion of incoming sunlight back into space to reduce the global temperature. Sometimes this is called solar geoengineering, sunlight reflection methods, various ideas. But of course, there's lots of uncertainties about this, and there are potential risks of its own. It might reduce climate risk on one level, bring new risks. Has there been any discussion or work done around adding these ideas into the models or into the various pathways?
Yes, let's say we're beginning to discuss that. by the representation of solar radiation management, or SRM, is very timid or almost non-existent. The reason for that is because these IMs, these integrated models, they need a lot of data, a lot of information, costs, useful life, efficiency, etc., etc. And before we have pilot projects, before we have, let's say, good data to show how those projects may perform into the future, how much they are going to cost, it's very difficult to put them in those models. We already do that, but because the costs we have today are extremely high, and most IAMs go through this, what we call least cost solution, these technologies are never chosen. So sometimes they are already represented in those models, but they are not chosen because those models still see a possibility for a 1.5-degree world without the need to rely on that. We still see a possibility for a 2-degree world without relying on that. But for sure, as we have been discussing here, the more, let's say, we continue without doing much, it's going to be much more difficult to reach ambitious climate targets. And for sure, SRM may be in the future a possibility. We're trying to avoid that as of today, but eventually this is not going to be possible. And that's why it's so important, even if our models are not choosing that as a solution yet, it's important to study that issue. It's important to begin to advance on that, because if in the near future we realize that 1.5 degrees is not possible anymore, only with SRM, we have to have technologies that are mature enough for us to risk trying to deploy them.
You use the word risk, and that's often one of the big challenges here. Is there's no risk-free pathway. You're measuring one set of risks against another set of risks. And I guess with SRM, you have the idea of a world with SRM, and whatever side risks might come with that, measured against the risks of a hotter world without SRM, which contains some things that we know, but also a lot of uncertainty. How on earth does one go about measuring these risks against each other? How does a policymaker begin to say, well, there's this versus this? How do you do that?
Mark, I think we are not at this stage yet. Let's say we still have a possibility of a world not being warmer, not being hot, and not with the need to rely on SRM. So that's why, let's say, this most recent IPCC report shows exactly that. The window to do that is closing. So the window is not that open anymore, but it's still slightly open. So we still have a chance, let's say, of reaching 1.5 degree without the need to rely on SRM. But the window is closing, and let's say eventually in the near future, we're gonna need to weigh these different risks. What's better here? Let's say to go to a technology that's not technology proved yet, is not fully tested yet, or we may decide not to go to that route and try to explore the risk of living in a much warmer world. But let's say, I would say that we are not at this point in time, but as I said before, I think time is ripe for us to begin to investigate those technologies, to begin to play with that, to construct pilot projects, because eventually in the near future or in the medium term, we may need to consider that possibility. As of today, I would say most scientists think this is still too dangerous, and we don't fully understand all the implications of doing that. But we have to begin to study that possibility as well.
Well, thank you. Generally, you've been doing this work for a long time. We're seeing that it can be quite difficult to work in climate and to take on the sort of magnitude of this problem and the challenges it brings, and to maintain a sense of hope and enthusiasm in your own work, while also not burying your head in the sand or engaging in hopium, as the phrase is. How do you balance this? What do you do to keep on top of this subject while, you know, maintaining what seems to be a fairly sunny disposition?
Well, Mark, let's say we are the experts here, right? So officially, we're the ones that should better understand the problem, should better, let's say, understand the risks. So I think we are still able or capable of having some hope here. So we are trying to keep the stakes high, let's say, because we believe that we still have a chance. As I said, this chance is going down, the window is closing, but we still have hope to limit warming to 1.5 without overshoot, or 1.5 with some overshoot, or eventually to a 2-degree world. If we already begin to be too pessimistic about that, I think it's going to be a very bad message. So we're not hiding anything here. So we're not trying to not show everything we know. And basically, we know that it's still possible. But let's say we're trying to show we are in the middle of a climate crisis, meaning that it's not enough to be concerned and do nothing. So we're trying to show, okay, if you act in the very soon, let's say, if you act very actively, let's say, we still have a good chance of reaching where we want to be. But so let's say, that's why we still keep being hope, keeping all this hope. But you're right, let's say, it's not going to last forever. Let's say all this enthusiasm we have, that our chances are still high. So yeah, let's hope that we'll be able to do something here.
Well, thank you so much, Roberto Schaeffer, for fascinating C2G talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.